All right, so we're continuing with period 8, and I'm going to be talking about Nixon's other agendas outside of his involvement in Vietnam before we get into Watergate and all of that stuff in the next chapter. So I'm going to be wrapping up this chapter, chapter 37, here in this video. So Nixon, like I said, in previous videos, the early years of his presidency were really dominated by the Vietnam issue and his handling of student protesters and the bombing of Cambodia and all this other stuff. But overall, that's not really what Nixon is remembered for. And at the time, I'm sure it seemed like a huge issue that, his lies about Vietnam and him getting us, deeper involved and then finally ending the war were going to, play such a large role in his legacy. But overall, they don't. They're really not something that we think of often when we think of Nixon. A lot of what people think of is either Watergate or they think of his domestic policy if they're trying to put, a little more of a positive spin on it. Aside from how negative the people might have viewed Nixon in those early years because of Vietnam, by the time 1972 comes and we're really beginning to end our involvement in the conflict, Nixon has truly redeemed himself. He's seen as like this pioneer who's going to be pulling us out of all this social chaos. If you see this electoral map right here, all the red states are the states that went to Nixon in 1972. It's like the closest we've ever seen to a clean sweep. He only lost 2 places, Washington, D.C. and Massachusetts. That is all. Every other state went red and went to Nixon. And that's really because of how Nixon went into this next campaign. He tried really hard to position himself as the guy who ended Vietnam. He's getting us out of Vietnam finally. He's also finally brought the civil rights movement to an end, which a lot of people wanted, especially in the South. And that was something that Nixon called his Southern strategy. They were trying to target Southern voters specifically, and swing the South, which for, so long had been historically blue states and had gone to Democrats. Over the last, 2 to 3 decades, we've seen that shift some and it be a little blue and red at the same time, depending on the candidate and depending on the state. And so Nixon sees that as his opportunity to swing the South all the way to the Republican side and to get them to vote as a bloc once more like they did 100 years ago, but this time vote for a Republican. And ultimately it worked. He really targeted that what we would call the silent majority, middle class voters who don't protest because they work and are, middle class, middle America, especially white families in the South. He promised, I'm going to focus on economic issues. I'm going to end the war in Vietnam. We're going to end busing, and we're going to close this chapter of history and move forward. And for most white voters in the South, that's exactly what they wanted. They had been living in this period of turmoil from even after World War II, the South didn't really get a break, right? It was like right after World War II, the civil rights movement began, or we get into Korea and then the civil rights movement begins. And then it's this movement and that movement and that movement. And middle American voters, that silent majority, and those Southern voters, they really were looking for someone to calm things down. And that's exactly what Nixon said he was going to do. And shockingly, Nixon fared pretty well through several scandals. Vietnam and his handling of Cambodia and the Kent State Massacre weren't obviously his only scandals, and Watergate won't even happen until his second term. For example, the Pentagon Papers in 1971, during Nixon's first term, the New York Times was given a secret and classified report by a man who worked in the group that made the report, Daniel Ellsberg, and it was a report on American actions in Vietnam, and it talked a lot about, in the report, how Johnson and Kennedy had both lied not only to the American people but to Congress about our actions in Vietnam, not only in Vietnam, but in China. I mean, not in China, in Cambodia and in Laos, and and not only the actions that we had taken there, but why we were really doing it. And it basically just exposed a lot of lies that the government had been telling the American people. And it really showed how this war was really a scam in a lot of ways. And those papers were leaked and published by the New York Times and picked up by mainstream media. And it didn't necessarily reflect poorly on Nixon. It was really about Johnson and Kennedy and the lies that they had told to the American people. Most of America already knew Nixon's lies because he had already basically come forward and been like, yeah, I lied about that. This is what we were really doing. Although there were some things in there that did implicate Nixon. And shockingly, Nixon was able to just ride the whole thing out, sort of. He invoked, the Espionage Act and had Ellsberg charged. Eventually, those charges were dropped. And he was able to really restrict the media in several ways, getting injunctions against newspapers like the New York Times, but also the Washington Post, and really controlling the narrative that was being put out about the entire situation. Nixon had, and the people that worked for him really had a knack for being able to ride out all of these things. The summer of his election, 1972, is when the Watergate break-in occurred, but he was able to keep that so far out of the news that by the time it really became an issue, the election was already over and he had already been inaugurated into his next term. Now, the two big things that we would know Nixon for in terms of his domestic policy. The first would be his progressive agenda on the environment. Nixon's definitely known as something that we would call a rhino, R-I-N-O, which stands for Republican in name only. And what that basically means is it's someone who calls themselves a Republican and is a member of the Republican Party, but they don't actually support most Republican agendas, or the agendas that they do support or push are traditionally more liberal or something that the Democratic Party would push. And the environmental issues are a great example of that. Nixon signed into law not only creating the EPA, but he signed the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Air Pollution Control Act. All of those things were signed into law by Nixon, and those really restricted what companies were able to do with their chemical pollutants and industrial waste. And that's not necessarily something, that's the government controlling business. That's not typically a Republican move. That's typically a more Democratic move. So that's one of the reasons why we would give Nixon that label of being a rhino. The next thing that we're going to see start to happen here during Nixon's administration, the thing that his domestic agenda is going to have to tackle, is a new period of economic issues. In that post-war period, we were like thriving. We were doing great. But once we get into the 1970s, we're going to see a very, very different economic situation. We were not thriving in the way that we had been previously. It was certainly something very different, and it's several reasons. One thing that's happening is something called stagflation, which is a combination of when your economic growth is stagnant and your inflation is also increasing. So increased inflation and stagnant economic growth. If it's stagnant, that means it's not increasing or decreasing. It's just remaining the same. It's hitting a plateau. And normally inflation is nothing to freak out about, because typically economic growth will mirror inflation, and the price of this might go up, but so does your income, so it sort of cancels each other out and it's not a huge deal. But in a situation like this, stagflation, prices are increasing, incomes are not, and so that's when people really start to feel economic strains. And there's going to be a lot of attempts to overcome stagflation, and really none of them are going to be successful. It's something that we're going to be dealing with all through the 1970s. Nixon will try to deal with it. Carter will try to deal with it. Ford will try to deal with it. None of them are really successful. We're not going to see ourselves get into another period of prosperity, and that prosperity is arguable in the 1980s. So aside from stagflation, one of the other things causing this economic crisis is our massive war debt that we've racked up from from the Vietnam War, spending $150 billion on that. And on top of that, we didn't only spend a lot of money on the war. Johnson, remember, was also very supportive of social issues and social programs as part of his war on poverty and his Great Society agenda. And Kennedy also ramped up a lot of military spending and part of his, flexible response initiative. And we had really accrued a large national debt by this time, which a lot of people were worried about. And it was we were starting to see restrictions on interest rates, and that was affecting things. The third thing that's going to be messing with our economy is actually the oil crisis of the 1970s. So get ready, because I'm about to say oil a lot of times. It started with OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. If you remember, these countries were the original 5 were the largest oil-producing countries in the world. It was Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. There were other countries that were members of OPEC, but these 5 were like the original founders, and they're like the main members of the organization. And in the 1970s, OPEC put an embargo on the United States and the Western allies of Israel, because they didn't like Israel. They've never there's all sorts of beef there that we don't need to get into. But nevertheless, our alliance to Israel and our involvement with them is what caused this embargo to happen. Us not having this access to this oil supply that we're so used to caused gas prices in the United States to go up by 400%. So imagine what you paid for gas the last time you filled up your tank, quadruple it. And that's what essentially happened to gas prices in the 1970s. And because of that, people, when they would go fill up, they would stockpile gas in gas canisters so that they could get it at the current rate, because they knew it would only continue to increase. So that led to a gas shortage. And so a lot of gas stations wouldn't have gas, or some people would, some states had to institute rules where you were only allowed to get gas on certain days, at certain times, and you were only allowed to get so much. It's sort of like the supply hoarding that we're seeing now during this global pandemic, during the coronavirus and everything. It's a very similar situation. So all of these things combined are really going to hurt our economy, and it's something that Nixon's going to try to overcome throughout his presidency. He won't be successful at it, and truthfully, neither will anyone else.